So now let's start thinking about our, again, however you want to count it, 4 or 5 steps. The first thing we need to do before we really get officially to step 1, like we've seen in some previous chapters, is that there's some preparation work we need to do first. So we're making that a formal step in the process. So before we get to step 1, we're going to do a preparation stage. We need to look at the problem and take an inventory that we're working on. What parts did they give us? What parts are we missing? And then we need to use the problem to get the missing pieces. As always, I'm never going to give you a hypothesis test, nor does the book, so far as I have ever seen, give you a hypothesis test that, surprise, it's unsolvable. It's always enough information. You just have to use your critical thinking skills to figure out, how do I put these pieces together? So just like we saw before, particularly with repeated measures t-tests, we saw if we did some prep work first, when we got to our calculation step, we could just plug and play in our formulas and it just went like clockwork. Same thing here. We need to get ourselves organized with some basic calculations first, and then when we really are working our formulas, it becomes much easier to manage. So what do we need to make sure we have in order to start our hypothesis test? Well, we need to know what the value of K is, how many treatments. Remember, this is the number of treatments in the study, treatment conditions. We need to know the values for all the small n or lowercase n values, how many scores were in each sample. We need to know the total number of scores for the entire study. We need to know the treatment totals for each group. We need to know the grand total of scores for that group. So these are things we just saw in the previous clip as new notation. So we need to know all those things. In addition, there's some old things that we're going to need to make sure we've got squared away to in our prep stage. So we're also going to need to know things like this. The summation of the squared raw scores for the entire experiment. So that's usually going to be a pretty big number. Most of the time the problems will give it to you. But if it doesn't, guess what? You got to do it by hand. You got to look at every raw score in the entire study, square that value, and then add all those squared values together. If it doesn't give it to you, you got to get it yourself. So we're going to need that as part of our prep work. We're also going to need to know the sum of squares for the first treatment condition, second treatment condition, and third treatment conditions. This is our regular sums of squares formula. Again, that we've been doing since back in chapter 4. If the problem gives it to you, which often it will, yay, you don't have to compute it. If it doesn't, then you've got 3 sums of squares you've got to calculate. So depending on how much legwork the problem does for you, you might have quite a bit of grunt calculations to take care of first before you really get to the formulas. Now, the text in particular also talks about needing the sample means for each sample. I'm going to kind of section this off with parentheses here. The truth is, I don't normally include that in my prep work. We'll see later that we don't always need these numbers. Sometimes we need the sample means, and sometimes we don't. So as far as I'm concerned, why calculate them if we need them calculated? Again, if it gives it to us, great. But why calculate something we might not actually need in the end? It seems strange to us. We're used to looking for mean differences by calculating the means and subtracting them, but remember, we're using variance to look at mean differences now. So we're not actually using the means to calculate mean differences, not in a standard test here. So we might need those, we might not need those. And then the last thing that I often describe as part of the preparation stage is to build a results table. Now, what I want you to do is get into, if you haven't already got into Canvas, and get the formula handouts for these 2 chapters, chapters 12 and 13, and print that out or have it available on a screen you can get to as we go through these. Because the formula table itself, let me grab one right over here. So on Canvas, you have a handout that looks like this on one side, and it's a dividing line. So these are formulas down here for chapter 14. We don't need to worry about that right now. Here's all our chapters for this, all our formulas for this chapter. And on the flip side are all the formulas for next chapter, for chapter 13. So it's a very good idea to have this with you. as we're going through this lecture to be able to look at it, because in particular, I'm not going to be able to draw this entire table on this little board. It's just not going to fit in a way that I can write it and you can read it. So we'll just have to work on it in pieces at a time. So it's got formulas in it now, but building a blank version of this table is called the results table. So all the answers you calculate are going to go in these boxes in place of where the formulas are. All of your answers must be in this table format. Must, must, must. If your answer is not in this table, you do not have an answer, period. So it makes it easier for you to keep track of we can see here 9 calculations, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And it makes it easier for me to find your 9 answers right there. Nothing goes in the results table that aren't results. You never put formulas in them. You never put scratch work in them. You never write notes to me in them. Just your numerical answers. So building this blank space, just this table with labeled sources between treatments, within treatments, in the total study, sums of squares, degrees of freedom, mean of squares, which is, again, just another way of saying variance. And then our F ratio goes right on the side of the table there. So we want to build this in advance in most cases, even though we won't be filling it in until step 3. Again, it's just getting ourselves ready. So before we do any of our 5 steps, these are the things we want to take of. Do we have all of these values available to us, and do we have our workspace set up? Once we can say we've got all of that ready to go, then we can begin our 4 steps. So we'll start step 1 in the next clip.